And I want to be really careful here. You know, one of the things that's one of the defining features of Mississippi to me, and of white Mississippians in particular, but not exclusively, is when an outsider, their term, comes and wants to talk to them about Mississippi, they get really defensive really quickly. And I've had lots of personal experiences of this. People have heard my accent and started telling me all the reasons I was wrong before I've said a single thing. It certainly was the way in which Mississippians responded to Reconstruction. It certainly was the way in which they responded to the challenge of civil rights. If calling civil rights agitators communists, and agitators also belongs in quotation marks, was one of the kind of universal responses to civil rights activism, the other was that they're outsiders, they're agitators. Everything's fine here. People aren't content here until these outside agitators, communists, came in and started stirring things up. These issues are still enormously sensitive, and you still run into enormous amounts of defensiveness. And if you're going to start trying to teach this in your classrooms, you will likely run into some conflict and defensiveness among your students, and you're also quite apt to have some parents get extremely angry when they get a version from their kids of what they were learning in their classes. Now, speaking of for myself, one of the things that where I actually sympathize with at least part of the kind of knee-jerk response that a lot of Mississippians have is it's not like race relations in other parts of the country are all hunky-dory. But there's a way in which Mississippians became in some ways the symbol of the ugliest face of white supremacy. Not only in the nation, but in this, even within the Jim Crow South. And became, you know, in some ways something that the other Northerners, in particular white Northerners, could feel morally superior to. But with that proviso, or that introduction, let's talk a little bit about white resistance. And the main point I want to make here is that it was well-nigh universal. And you're going to have to really think hard about how to teach this. In the same way, frankly, that people in Germany after the Second World War would have to think very hard about what happened here. And I don't say that, I hope I don't say that in any way self-righteously. I think, to be frank, if I'd lived in Mississippi in 1963, I wouldn't have acted much different from anybody else. This is an organization called the White Citizens Council. It was established initially in Greenwood. Its headquarters then were in Indianola, spread across the South. This was created in response to the Brown v. Board decision. And it was basically designed to stop. And what the White Citizens Council would do, some people refer to this as the Uptown Klan. What the White Citizens Council would do would be to try to use various kinds of pressure. So if somebody went and tried to register to vote, the local newspaper announced a new policy, that there would be a column in the paper every week about the people who tried to register to vote then. And those people would be fired. The bank would call in any credit or their mortgage, all these kinds of things. In addition to the Citizens Council, there was an official arm of the Mississippi state government called the State Sovereignty Commission. Some of you may have looked then at the papers of the State Sovereignty Commission, which basically was a shadow government chaired by the governor of the state that conducted surveillance, essentially a kind of secret police that conducted surveillance on civil rights activists. The Klan also, you know, most white Mississippians, a tiny fraction of white Mississippians were in the Klan. But the Klan did experience a new lease on life. In 1960, there was no operating Klan in the state of Mississippi. But in 62, 63, 64, as civil rights activism began to grow, a new organization, the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. Here's an application to join them. That's their head, a man named Sam Bowers, who would ultimately die in prison. So here's an application for citizenship in the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. Would enjoy a new lease on life. Klan violence was particularly strong in southwest Mississippi. And the threats of violence could be directed not only against black people who were involved in civil rights activism, but also against white people who were seen as not sufficiently supportive of the existing racial regime. So, you know, there were firebombs and stones thrown into the newspaper office here in Macomb because the editor there, a man named Oliver Emmerich, was seen as suspect in his commitment to white supremacy. It's hard today, and I want to set this up because we're also going to have, in addition to a speaker telling us today about the Bergman walkout, a person talking to us about living through that time here and trying to challenge that edifice of white supremacy as a white person. It's very difficult to imagine today the kind of cultural pressures that were brought to bear on people to toe the line. Particularly famous example in the city of Macomb, where a local family called the Hefners. I think actually their daughter had been Miss Mississippi, so she was pretty, or even Miss America.
Her name was Jan Nave. She was Miss Mississippi.
So this is a pretty prominent family. Met a couple of white civil rights workers who were visiting, and met them at church on a Sunday, and invited them over for dinner, just to hear about what they were doing. And they were run out of town. They were run out of the town of Macomb because they had had two civil rights workers in their home. So that tone created a kind of license for extraordinary violence. This is an interracial group of ministers at a church in Macomb that had been bombed. Macomb became known as the dynamite capital of Mississippi. This is the house in the black neighborhood of Macomb, it's no longer there, where the SNCC field workers were living after it had been firebombed. This is a local tough beating up a white SNCC worker who had come to observe a demonstration. In fact, I think that's Tom Hayden, who would later marry Jane Fonda. So you can insert your own joke there. The point here is that to actually step outside this would have required a kind of courage that I think very few of us possess. So there's one of the things I think that's somehow crucial when you teach students. It's too easy for us when we look back at the past to think, well, gosh, if I'd been there, I would have fought against Hitler. I would have stopped this. I would have been against slavery. I would have been, to actually live in a society where there's an enormous amount of unity and enormous pressure built around the centers. I think most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, probably wouldn't have behaved any differently from most of the people there. But perhaps we can talk about that. That violence ultimately escalated into murder. This is a marker to Herbert Lee. This is his wife. Herbert Lee was murdered in Liberty, Mississippi. He had gotten involved with Bob Moses in voter registration. He was at the local cotton gin, a local white man named E.W. Hearst, a state legislator. who had grown up with and knew Herbert Lee, pulled a gun on him and demanded that Herbert Lee get himself out of that civil rights mess. Herbert Lee said to him, "I'm not talking to you till you put that gun away." And he shot him dead on the spot. Herbert Lee's body lay at that cotton gin for 3 hours in front of God and the world.